right. Hello, everyone. For those of you tuning in online or who might end up watching the recorded version, happy Thursday. My name is Jack Gorsline. I am the founder of, as you can see, Psychedelic States of America. I'm an investigative reporter. And this is, I guess, now the third iteration of the Psychedelic States of America Advocacy Spotlight Initiative, a new project that we've been working on diligently with the great folks at Lucid News and Psychedelics Today, to really kind of put a face on psychedelic policy reform efforts across the U.S. with the goal of interviewing an advocate or advocacy group in all 50 states, plus D.C. and Puerto Rico before hopefully the end of the year. I'm joined today, fresh off of some incredible developments at the Texas State House in Austin. Logan Davidson, Executive Director for Texans for Greater Mental Health. Logan, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, Jack. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, really glad we were able to make this work. For some background, I was actually in Austin last week, and we'd hoped to be able to get this interview scheduled in person, but there's been so much happening that it made more sense to push while when I got back onto the East Coast. But I was down in Austin last week for the ACT conference, which shout out to Olivia McDonnell and Mary Olivar. It was billed as the first ever psychedelic guides and facilitators conference. Really a fascinating event, and I think in the shadow of so much going on, the State House really played nicely to being able to get a good feel for not only what you guys have cooking from a policy reform standpoint, but really how deep the psychedelic community runs, not only in Austin, but across Texas. Met some great folks from Houston. We did a little Lone Star Plant Medicine showcase in partnership with the Texas Cannabis Collective that really shined a light on potential advocacy efforts, between both groups, together with both groups, hopefully down the line. But yeah, again, just really thrilled to be here. And there's obviously been so much going on. So let's get to the latest news. Last night, from my understanding, the Texas House passed the Texas Ibogaine Initiative bill. Correct me on the exact title, if you will. But can you give us just a brief overview of the latest developments, and then we'll dig into what the bill actually is, proposing to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Texas Ibogaine Initiative is kind of what the name of the bill is, and also the kind of working name of the coalition of everybody who worked on this, because it really was a coalition effort. If anybody was missing from the team, I don't think we could have gotten it done. As far as what happened, so it was announced last night. The Lieutenant Governor put out a statement on Twitter, on X, essentially announcing that he and Speaker Dustin Burrows had worked together to fully fund the Ibogaine Initiative with $50 million in matching grants to the $50 million that will be put up by a developer for this public-private partnership. And so that was really the first moment that it was made public. It was actually last week that the budget conference committee came together and secured the funding. And we have all been kind of waiting for the moment that we could talk about it publicly. So that's really exciting. And then the last things that'll happen now, the bill is in conference committee working out some final language tweaks. The House and Senate will approve, and then it'll head to Governor Abbott's desk for his signature in the next few weeks.
Amazing. So yeah, we will come back to the 50 million and what that research might look like and how that might affect the state economy, et cetera, shortly. But you mentioned that there's really been an incredible team behind this. And for reference to those tuning in, actually this morning we published kind of what's the first of a companion column with future interviews like this through Lucid News that Logan was kind enough to sit with my co-author of that piece, Noah Daly, for. And we talked a lot about how really unique this coalition is. One thing that really stands out to me is, obviously, as the old adage goes, everything's bigger in Texas. We ran that as the song promoted for our Instagram post for this live stream for a reason. But the specific language that you guys have used in your messaging to invoke like pride in championing this for the state of Texas, for this movement and what it would mean down the line for other states and conservative, strongholds. Can you speak to a little bit how the team building process came together and really, as I'm sure you've said in other interviews, but why Texas makes the most sense to make this next big leap in psychedelic policy reform in the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. So you could say the team building for this really started 4 years ago when Texas passed House Bill 1802, which was the first piece of psychedelic legislation passed through a legislature, not through a ballot initiative, and also established the first state-funded psychedelic clinical trial, and that's psilocybin for veteran PTSD. It's actually underway right now at Baylor College of Medicine. And when that legislation was passed, it was also a coalition effort Vets, Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, was kind of the significant veteran advocacy leader. Warrior Angels Foundation, which is founded by a former Green Beret here in Texas, was also phenomenally helpful to great Texas nonprofits. Then Dr. Lynette Averill, who is a researcher at Baylor College of Medicine and at the Menninger Clinic, and also a co-founder and leader of Reason for Hope and the Veteran Mental Health Leadership Coalition.
Great.
So we established legislative precedent there, got a team together there. And then Texans for Greater Mental Health has really kind of kept the lights on in Texas since then, doing some diligent, deep work, because we have a legislature that is open to psychedelic medicine policy, that is educated, at least certainly compared to some of the other legislatures in the state. And then when the Kentucky Ibogaine Initiative, ran into its roadblocks, was unsuccessful, the Reed Foundation hired Brian Hubbard to lead the American Ibogaine Initiative, and they started looking for where is the next state. Mm-hmm. And the work we had done in 2021, that group kind of comes together in an informal meeting, a series of informal meetings starting last fall. And then over a period of time, it kind of coalesced into a large ragtag team, but I think a great team, kind of an army of the righteous that included veteran advocacy organizations, psychedelic advocacy organizations, researchers, and, really critically, Brian Hubbard kind of as the leader figure and spokesperson for the movement.
Yeah, I've not met Brian yet personally. I know that, obviously has been a pioneer in this space. Would love to speak with him soon. Brian, if you're listening in, definitely hit me up. Much to discuss, and I have a lot of thoughts in the state of Kentucky and where they might be headed, with some roots in my personal history in the state of Kentucky as well. I also just want to note, VETS has really done an extraordinary job putting the full court press on psychedelic policy reform in conservative states. I know they've been involved a little bit in North Carolina with our mutual friend, Gina Giorgio. Really excited to see what comes from that in the near future. But you talked about, the initial push 4 years ago. You were on the ground floor of that, right? You were working as a chief of staff in the Texas State House long before Ibogaine was ever really at the forefront of this conversation. What led you personally down this path? And how did you end up being really the political quarterback, if you will, to really drive this conversation forward and bring so many of these folks into this room?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was legislative director and then chief of staff for Representative Alex Dominguez, who is now a former state rep, but at the time occupied a really interesting place in the legislature. He served on the Appropriations Committee. He served on one of the Calendars Committees. He was a former prosecutor. He had a lot of credibility, and he had been, really kind of paying attention to what was happening in the veteran community. He had established the first veteran diversion court in South Texas, and what he knew is what we were doing was insufficient, was not working, and so he started looking for something new, maybe a little bit radical, certainly novel. And he filed House Bill 1802 actually shortly before he hired me. He and my colleague and then predecessor in the office, Houston Tower, kind of conceived of this idea, looking to start a conversation. I had some, personal experiences in the psychedelic world, had worked on veteran legislation, PTSD legislation, first responder legislation in the past, had bipartisan experience. And then had really followed the research that was happening as we saw, it go from maybe anecdotal conversations to Johns Hopkins University, UCSF, even the Ivies now having psychedelic research centers. And so when Alex brought this bill forward, it was kind of, the culmination of all these different things that I've been working on, and had the opportunity to serve as kind of the lead staff steward on that piece of legislation. We passed that, and then Alex left the legislature after, and he, working alongside Texans for Greater Mental Health's founder, Eric Kozendar, formed this organization so that way psychedelic policy in Texas would not fall to the whims of an election or to a legislative session, that there would be an entity kind of working the whole time. And they recruited me to join. It was an absolute, privilege to be able to do it and bring what was at that time, 8 years, now 10 years of experience working in Texas legislative politics to bear for something that's a personal passion. And I also think the kind of next great leap forward in mental health treatment and really turning the paradigm upside down.
Yeah, and one of the things that's so interesting, like I mentioned about kind of the messaging that you guys have employed surrounding the Texas Ibogaine Initiative, is the description of Texas needing to be a leader in this space. But that stems beyond just the actual research in the lab and veterans receiving treatment. You mentioned very prominently in a fantastic quote in our Lucid column that came out this morning about the history of Texas's leadership in science and technology and research, and it really innovating in, with that really strong statewide, reverence and adherence to an interest in involving private entities as well. So can you speak to a little bit kind of that history, but also to your quote, like why this conversation is really something that's in Texas's groundwater, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think to a lot of people, they'll look at Texas, or especially if they're not from here, have an understanding of us from media or social media, or memes of people waving cowboy hats and guns around. We do have paved roads in the Lone Star State, but if you go back to our history, really as a leader in innovation, I mean, JFK's speech at Rice University, "We will go to the moon," right? Happened here. Johnson Space Center is here. The Texas Medical Center, really the crown jewel of Texas of medical research in the entire world, certainly in the United States, is right there in Houston, Texas. And then the University of Texas at Austin, what starts here changes the world. And those are just a few of the flagship institutions in the state that have really led innovation. And you even now today have in the private space industry, SpaceX launching rockets from Boca Chica Beach, which notably was in Alex's district, actually, when I worked for him.
Very
and
cool.
So there has been, I think there's something really interesting about Texas. We are a leader state, and we certainly take that with pride, but also with a deep responsibility. Sure, we're conservative, but I think we are individualist more than anything, and still kind of a frontier state, even though we're one of the most urban, largest economies on the planet at this point. And so when opportunity arises, when something is clearly failing in our society, and when we can find a solution, I think Texas really prides itself on owning that leadership role and stepping in and saying, if not me, then who? And if there's no one else doing it, we certainly will do it. And Texas has looked at, the federal government has looked at our peer states and said they're not moving the way that we think that they should be. And so we take action to set a standard that we hope will be followed by the rest of the country.
Yeah, and so with a pioneering, trailblazing supporter from within the state house like Rep. Dominguez, kind of leaving the state political scene. Obviously, you guys have had great support from conservative lawmakers of former Texas representation, i.e. Rick Perry, former governor. Obviously, I think that appearance on Joe Rogan, I in my original draft of the Lucid article, I described it as like a psychedelic history Hall of Fame moment. I think it'll be burned into our brains for a long time as Rick Perry sitting there and saying that he's good friends with Rick Doblin of all people, and they couldn't disagree more on certain things like drug decriminalization policy, but that there's a real interest in advancing this issue forward from a healing perspective, and that they're able to come into this room together and discuss that. I think is really special. But in the State House now, I'm very curious to hear from you. Who have been some of the strongest allies? I know Rep. Cody Harris put out a really phenomenal statement. Yesterday, he gave a quote on the State House that we quoted in our article this morning, describing Ibogaine as a whisper of redemption. I think that's one of the most eloquent and beautiful ways I've heard it described. Rep. Harris has been a great ally, but who else has really championed this from both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very long list. I'm very happy to report that there are a lot of champions on this issue in the State House there. So Senator Tan Parker, who carried the Ibogaine Initiative Companion SB 2308, which is the bill that's going to become law. Senator Donna Campbell, who was the sponsor for House Bill 1802. She is a physician who recognized the science and the potential of these medicines, especially when done right, and has kind of owned that leadership role there. In the House, we mentioned Cody Harris. I think what also stands out, Representative Ramon Romero, representative from Fort Worth, Texas. He's a Democrat who has been just a workhorse in support of this initiative, along with Representative John Busey, a Democrat from Austin, Texas. And then I really want to highlight Representative Tom Oliverson, who is also a physician. He's the chairman of the House Republican Caucus, and similar to Senator Campbell, has, I think, I don't know for sure, but I think was aware of psychedelic medicine and research before the legislation was ever brought forward, even back in 2021, and certainly has followed it since, believes in the potential, and has taken action, to kind of support this, both in supporting the Ibogaine Initiative and also supporting other legislation like rescheduling trigger reform to ensure that once these are approved, they're available to Texas patients as quickly as any other patients in the country, and working with Representative Busey and Senator Cesar Blanco and Senator Jose Menendez, Democrats from El Paso and San Antonio. Cesar is a Navy veteran, to advance some regulatory legislation that will help us prepare for when these are approved, that they are available, accessible to Texas patients from, looking at affordability, looking at treatment guidelines, looking at provider training, licensure, and provider availability. And those are just a few of the champions. And one final name who I really want to recognize from the membership is Representative Katrina Pearson, who this is her first term in the State House, and who really came to be a powerhouse champion for this alongside her colleague, Mike Olcott, both on the Public Health Committee both occupying kind of the conservative end of the spectrum, but who recognized what needed to be done and, really went to work for this. And finally, you couldn't talk about psychedelics in Texas without acknowledging the leadership of Lieutenant Governor Patrick, Governor Abbott, and Speaker Burrows, who before he was Speaker of the House, was a chairman in the House in 2021, chairman of House Calendars, and was a joint author on House Bill 1802, as a matter of fact. So the support really, really runs deep. It's actually harder to find someone who doesn't support these initiatives than it is to find people who do.
And Alcott is a really interesting character because he was a cancer researcher, a longtime researcher at the University of Kentucky before ending up at Texas and going into state politics. And I think he was even on the record as saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that like a couple of years ago, he would have never voted on this, but he's seen from working with you all, from hearing from advocates, the power of and potential of Ibogaine and other psychedelics. I am curious because there was another bill that was filed that I think would have put forth about $500,000 towards psilocybin and MDMA related research. Is there plans to revisit that at some point? I know that there have been some minor language changes to the Senate companion bill that makes it very clear that this research is going to be done in the state of Texas and the state of Texas alone. But do you envision an expansion to future psychedelic research, whether it's in a potentially amended version or in the legislative session next year?
Yeah, great question. So, Texas started with psilocybin research. Our support for Ibogaine does not necessarily mean that we're going to ditch everybody else. You've got the McGill Center for Psychedelic Research and Therapy at UT, who are really researching the full spectrum of psychedelic medicines. I think the bill you're referencing is House Bill 4014, which is carried by Busey in the House, Blanco in the Senate. And that legislation is actually supporting a patient accessibility study, which is kind of a recognition that psilocybin and MDMA especially are going to be available and available much faster than we expect. Now, from like the individual perspective, it may feel like a long time because it's years away, but from a governmental perspective, that's very soon, and you need to start taking action beforehand. Yet that piece of legislation is actually, we have 11 days left in session. That piece of legislation has passed the House, is in the Senate, has been referred to the Health and Human Services Committee, and there are a few hearings left. So we are still working hard. That's actually why I've got the suit on. I'm headed to the Capitol after this. Still working hard to get that moving. If at the end of session, we have passed the Ibogaine Initiative and didn't get the other things that Texans for Greater Mental Health was working on, certainly I think the conversation is going to continue in Texas about both how do we ensure that these treatments are available to the patients who need them, are accessible, are affordable, and are delivered in a way that maximizes their efficacy and really reduces risk. And I think that really there is no limit to what I think we're going to be willing to have a conversation on. Will there necessarily be legislation next session? Will it be a $50 million appropriation? I'm not sure I'm willing to predict that, but certainly the legislature will continue conversations on psilocybin, MDMA, Ibogaine, and maybe even getting into some other treatment modalities down the road.
Exciting stuff. And good luck at the State House later today.
Thank you.
But obviously we've talked a big conversation in psychedelic assisted therapy and how this integrates into Western models of healthcare as access and affordability. It sounds like you guys have been having some conversations about what that might look like in reference to access to potential Ibogaine care, after the research phase. Obviously 4 to 5 years, even beyond, is a long time in human years, but when it comes to bureaucracy, that's a pretty speedy timeline comparatively. What does the basis of an affordability and access plan or protocol or structure look like based on the conversations you've been having with some of these partners?
Yeah, absolutely. In these conversations, you could really say, we discussed it 4 years ago, but, the heat got turned up when the FDA was considering the MDMA new drug application. And it became very real that these could be available in the next year or even sooner and under the Western model, right? And when we're thinking about affordability for these treatments, there's really kind of two things to take a look at. And kind of through our conversations, especially with stakeholders, like Tim Stacy, who's an advisor on our board of advisors, he's a ketamine-assisted psychotherapist here in the state, is a lot of focus is on making the medicine available. But when you think about psychedelic-assisted therapy, especially in the model that we're seeing delivered internationally, where it's legal and accessible now in environments in the United States where it's accessible in clinical research, there's preparation therapy, there's support while you are having the experience, and there's integration after. And ensuring that the costs for that are kept low or reasonable for people is really a priority. So just to get a little wonky for a second, currently billing codes for therapy max out at 2 hours. You get 1 hour and then two 30-minute extensions. Ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is about a 2.5-hour treatment. So right now in the state of Texas, you're in a position where either the patient is eating it, full cost, or the provider is having to do it. Mm-hmm. Now you start to think about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. We're talking 4, 6, 8 hours. We need to kind of rethink the way that we're gonna consider insurance coverage for this, both private insurance and also looking at Medicaid, TRICARE, Medicare, all of these different programs that deliver really the American healthcare system and make sure that it's affordable for our patients. And so ensuring that the compound, the molecule is covered is key. Also ensuring that wraparound care is covered and that we are thoughtful, flexible, and innovative in the way we're thinking about it, because there's almost nothing really in our current healthcare system that is like this, that takes the time, that has the wraparound care necessary. Obviously, there are treatments that have wraparound care included, but not where you have the support of something as powerful as a psychedelic.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought that up. It's something that we talked in circles about up here in Massachusetts in the run-up to our failed ballot initiative last year, the Question 4 campaign. A lot of people, rightfully so, myself included, are concerned about affordability, especially when you stretch out the average hourly rate for a social worker, which is probably the lowest level certification that will be required in certain legal medical contexts. Mm-hmm. It's like $100. So if you dole that out to 16 hours of care over a week, pre-prep and prep can be done weeks before. Mm-hmm. That's not something that insurance is going to cover. There's great examples of groups like Enthea, and there's Canna Coverage, which is now partnered with them to do some medical cannabis benefit coverage, woven in with employer benefits plans, even though it's not covered by health insurance. There's some really interesting concepts that people are throwing at the wall and seeing what sticks to try to make this stuff more affordable. And it just is really encouraging to hear that, you guys are thinking about that from the ground floor. It's a good segue to talking a little bit more about the public-private partnership model and where this $50 million might be coming from. Obviously, you mentioned there's going to be some matching grant funding from the state, but we're at a time right now where federal funding is getting cut left and right, and that's impacting psychedelic research in other states or just general neuroscience research in other states. So the timing of a public-private partnership like this is really good news because I would assume, have had at least discussions or conversations with where some of that private funding might be coming from. Are you able to share maybe some of the broad strokes or maybe even any names of partners you've been in discussion with who might pony up a couple million?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I want to speak quickly on kind of the changes happening with federal funding, and then I'll get into it.
Of course.
Certainly, we're experiencing a lot of changes at the federal level. And I think that's why state action is so important. It was already, I think, very important in leading the federal government. I think continuing to show them that psychedelic research is an efficient and impactful investment. It's something that will ring true, especially in this administration, but I hope in future administrations as well. But at the same time, we're seeing more action, more activity, especially on the funding side from states than we've ever seen before. You mentioned North Carolina, but also Georgia got a seven-figure appropriation into their budget to support psychedelic research at Emory University. And so we're starting to see, and it's interesting, southern states are really taking the lead a little bit here and challenging the rest of the country, both at the federal level and at the state level, to put their money where their mouth is a little bit and make sure that there's funding maintained or available. Talking specifically about our public-private partnership. So the plan for implementation is for 2 RFP processes, one for the drug developers that can participate. I haven't been in direct conversation with any of them. I think, the most appropriate thing is for those who work on legislation to do their jobs, and then the private sector can come in and do their jobs. But there are, I think, half a dozen or more developers that could potentially do this, that maybe have expressed interest to other people in the stakeholder group who are working on Ibogaine now and who see the opportunity here to focus in especially on conditions like opioid use disorder, maybe your traumatic brain injury, rather than just PTSD or some other indication. So that's one of the RFPs. The state will accept applications and then essentially, take the deal that is right for Texas. The other RFP will be related to identifying those treatment sites, the clinical trial sites. which you're going to have applications, I think, from the private sector and also from medical research universities and institutions of higher education in Texas. I don't know for certain that they will, but I would expect that 2 folks on that list are going to be Baylor College of Medicine, where the first state-funded trial in American history is underway right now, and the McGill Center, right, at UT Austin Del Med, 2 of the leading kind of psychedelic research institutions, certainly in Texas, but really in the United States. And what will come from that is a really unique partnership, right? The private sector, the state government, Health and Human Services Commission here in Texas, which is a phenomenal agency that does great work. And then these, research institutions all over the country, actually all over the state of Texas, who are really driving this forward. And, it goes back to innovation, scientific innovation, especially medical innovation, really being in the groundwater of Texas, something we pride ourselves on. And that's evidenced by the number of institutions that are engaged in psychedelic research here in Texas. Contrary to people's belief, we are spearheading a lot of this and research outside of psychedelics on neuroscience, on cancer, all kinds of things, dementia, all kinds of things.
Yeah, and also those are areas in which psychedelic research might be beneficial. I know that there's been talk of, obviously, end of life care related to psychedelic for psychological purposes, but I know obviously there's been some really great reporting on the potential future utilization of Ibogaine for early onset dementia and or Parkinson's. Noah Daly wrote a great piece for Lucid News that I would encourage folks to check out. But to your point about, I think there is often a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of how deep-rooted Southern investment, not even in just Texas, but in other states adjacent. The Tulane University has a phenomenal entheogens and psychedelic research facility. I know that I believe Charles Nichols, son of David Nichols, who's pioneer, actually works at a private-public partnership at UNC Chapel Hill on some really interesting serotonin-related research. His son Charles, I think, is at LSU, which obviously big SEC school, and you wouldn't think, especially because Louisiana has pretty strict drug laws, but then we're talking about jobs, pensions. We're talking about administrative staff that makes a wage based on the success or the funding for an initiative like this. It's so beyond just the science as to why investing in this next gen research is important for Southern states, especially as federal funding gets clipped. I'm really glad you mentioned that. I'm originally from Virginia. Grew up a big University of Virginia fan. I joked last week when I was in Texas a lot that I know a lot of Texans would say that I am not really that very Southern because I'm from Virginia. But there's a similar pride in our state with the University of Virginia in particular of wanting to be a leader in these spaces and having the academic and financial acumen to be able to do that and fund that ourselves. I also want to quickly highlight the University of Alabama, Birmingham has a phenomenal Dr. Peter Hendricks is, I think, one of the brightest minds in research today. Dr. Haley Duran was one of his proteges. I don't know if she's still down there, but read everything that they're publishing, support everything that they're doing. I think it's really important to have this Southern investment, especially as conservatives become more and more interested, because not only can you, again, it's a local investment, but you're stoking more and more pride in the issue being led by conservatives. So super grateful for you guys spearheading that as an ex-Southerner myself based in the Boston area now. Also very interesting to know that potentially half a dozen or more groups are interested. That leads me to, there's a lot of talk of integrating current research data in foreign spaces just across the border. There's any number of really phenomenal Ibogaine clinics. There's also some horror stories of groups in the underground that maybe shouldn't be doing some of the things that they're doing. But I am curious if you guys have been in conversation with any clinics that are working. I know the Beyond folks may have been involved in some of one of the Washington Ibogaine research bills that was filed. I really like those guys. I think they're doing some really cool stuff. Has it been a conversation at all to be partnering with existing clinics that have research protocol, care protocol already kind of baked into their operation as kind of a copy paste or kind of an integration of that as of their standards?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think certainly through this whole process, you've had input from those folks. That's through their Foundational Healing Grant Program, right? Sponsors special operations veterans and their spouses to go to Mexico to receive this kind of treatment at Ambio, one of the great clinics. You mentioned Beyond, which has a veteran service program, and Beyond veterans did play a role. The veterans of the Beyond Veteran Service Program did play a role here in the advocacy, and certainly just not to speak for Brian, but I know when he was doing the initial research on what he was going to do in Kentucky, conversations with those folks who are really setting the standard for how this works certainly informed that. As far as explicitly spelled out in statute, you're not going to see we're going to work with this clinic or with that clinic. What you have is an oversight board that has some kind of clear standards for what we want to see on that board, including subject matter experts. And I think that you can expect that to researchers, certainly, but also those practitioners who are able to bring that knowledge here back to the United States and certainly back to Texas. But we'll have to see, we'll get it signed by the governor and then implementation, and then we'll really get an understanding of who the team is going to be that's going to do this. But if I were to speculate, I would say it's going to be a very, very big team with diverse voices, diverse perspectives to ensure that we're getting this right. Because this is, 1802 was kind of a small step. This is really the giant leap in psychedelic research, not just in Texas, but I think for the United States. So we understand that eyes are on us. History might have its eyes on us. And so wanting to make sure we bring everybody in to make sure we get it right is absolutely a priority.
Yeah, and speaking of, you were recently in Washington, the National Press Club. I know Brian spoke. I know that my good friend Joe Moore was there as well. What has the reception been like? Obviously, new FDA, DEA administrative director recently noted that psychedelic research is a top priority for the Trump administration. But being there and speaking with folks who are in the psychedelic space and folks who aren't but interested, does this bill lead to potentially substantial federal policy leaps related to Ibogaine research?
Yeah, fantastic question. I was in Washington. I spoke on the same panel as Brian, and I might be along with Gul Dolan, moderated by Simeon Schnapper. I mean, some of the great minds of this movement across the country. I'm a little biased, but I do think we were kind of the most exciting conversation of the day. In one part because we're going to have closure on this very fast. That's the great thing about state legislatures is they might be smaller than Washington, but they move much faster than Washington. Mm-hmm. And I think another piece is there's a lot of people who, love or hate Texas and our politics who really appreciate Texas's willingness to be the first through the breach. And that was certainly something that I think came through there. Will it lead to federal action? Certainly, we hope so. I mean, absolutely, we hope so. I think, Secretary Collins at the VA has expressed, interest and potential support for continuing research and maybe expanding veteran access to psychedelic assisted therapies. You've got Secretary Kennedy. There's a lot of folks across the current administration. And then I think also in Congress, you have champions like Dan Crenshaw and Morgan Luttrell, both Texans, both veterans of the Navy SEAL teams. You have Jack Bergman and Lou Correa, the co-chairs of the PATH caucus leading this. So the stage is set for action in Washington. And I think there's some precedent for this. Texas passed our psychedelic research legislation in 2021. Morgan Luttrell actually was one of the kind of key stakeholders, key witnesses for that effort right before he ran for Congress. Congressman Luttrell got there, worked alongside Congressman Crenshaw and, other folks, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ro Khanna, because psychedelics is always a bipartisan achievement. You cannot find a single psychedelic victory that has been partisan and not been overwhelmingly bipartisan. Yeah. And they passed the Douglas McDay Act as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which provided the first legislatively approved federal appropriation for psychedelic research. And so I think you can see Texas kind of led the federal government there. That was a $10 million appropriation. Texas just went to 50. So now we'll wait and have to see what the federal government's going to do next.
I just keep thinking about it's Rick Perry said on Joe Rogan earlier this year that he would like to see Ibogaine move to Schedule 3. I know you probably can't speak on that. I know that there's probably very limited conversations, or if any, happening at the DEA right now. But I do think that that's just a really interesting thread for people to keep an eye on. I also want to note Marcus Luttrell is just a really impressive guy. And I think the Wall Street Journal article that came out recently about his experiences, why he wants conservatives to take a lead, will be remembered as a very pivotal piece of media coverage on this issue. And to your point, there hasn't really been a psychedelic policy advancement yet that was strictly partisan one way or the other. It is, as I have said to publicly here on these live streams before and elsewhere, I really believe that the political arm of the psychedelic renaissance, as it's been called, will be remembered as one of the most consequential political movements of the 21st century because of just that. There's any number of issues that Republicans and Democrats agree on in theory and on principle, but when you get them a room to talk, get them all into a room to talk about it, they can't just talk about the thing they agree on. Mm-hmm. Psychedelics seems to defy every partisan boundary and every political rule that we tend to think exists in today's political landscape, which is why Texas being a leader is all the more important. To that point, trying to think, checking my notes here. even beyond the policy landscape, there are a number of really fascinating psychedelic advocates. You and I are both aware of Justin Lepre, who's the founder of the Illuminating Co. just outside of Austin. How has the kind of alt psychedelic or like maybe semi-psychedelic underground played a role in shaping your perception of the need to advance this? And how might that influence potentially, future research focused versus clinical care focused policy reform efforts? Has there been conversations with legislators about, hey, like there's already people using these things in ceremony, there's already groups that are operating in a semi-religious context or a strictly religious context. How can we protect them more with what comes next? Has that been a part of the conversation yet, or do you anticipate that being a part of the conversation in the future?
Yeah, certainly. I think it will be a growing part of the conversation. As far as their protections, and I'm certainly not an expert in that side of the policy, but I believe that there are strong federal protections for religious freedom and religious use, right? I think that you can look at just the proliferation of psychedelic churches across the United States as evidence that there is still some level of protection. I think there certainly are legislators who are aware, absolutely, who are aware of that, not just in Texas, but I think across the entire country, and who are looking at, you have kind of all these different streams in the psychedelic community, and they cross at various times and they come together at various times. And eventually, right at the end of this is a psychedelic ecosystem that is really defined by the diverse options that people may have for treatment. What I think is really clear from the church, religious freedom setting, also from the international retreat setting, is that, it's providing people access now if they're willing to access it under those contexts. And you're somewhat limited in the scope and scale. I think it's one of the things that is spurring action, especially from a state level, even at the federal level, of following kind of this FDA medicalized route, because it's not just about, ensuring delivery of care and insurance coverage and all of that. That obviously is very important. That's important from an accessibility perspective, because both of those other contexts are still very expensive. It's also important from a scale perspective. You think we have 300 plus million Americans, 50 million, if I'm not mistaken, with a mental health diagnosis. Who knows how many tens of millions more who are suffering, struggling, but have not taken the step to get the diagnosis yet. How are these going to be accessible to everybody in a way that makes sense to them, that they're used to getting? Because, to someone who has only ever gone to a physician for their treatment, or to a psychiatrist for their treatment, to suggest, hey, you should hop on a plane and go to Mexico, or to the British Virgin Islands, the Dominican Republic to do this, or go to Peru. There are some people who will jump at that opportunity. There are some people who would never do that, ever, ever, ever. So how are you going to reach everybody who is critically in need? And I think that, the alt psychedelic movement, the church movement, all of that really brings to the fore that there is this great scale of need, that we need to meet and address that need. And there are lessons to be learned. There are things that have been done right. There are lessons to be learned. There are things that have been done wrong. And that's the opportunity now as policymakers really turn the page and turn their focus on psychedelics from saying these are drugs that we must prohibit and interdict, over to these are medicines that we must research and support and make available to the people who need them, not just veterans with PTSD, right? But survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse with PTSD, depression patients, anxiety patients. We talk a lot in the United States, I think certainly in Texas, but I really feel the entire United States, about the need to find new treatments for terminal conditions. Cancer is such a big one, right? You have right to try passed to allow folks to try experimental drugs if they're terminal and they've exhausted other treatments. Mental health conditions can be terminal. If you are suicidal because of depression or because of PTSD, and you are in a position where the ideation is potentially going to turn into action, your life expectancy is maybe not that different from someone with a terminal diagnosis for cancer. And so finding treatments that can meet that terminal need is, I think, a huge priority, and one that is growing in the United States.
So well said. Super important to touch on. You mentioned the domestic violence and sexual abuse aspect, and women in particular. I think it's 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women has experienced some form of abuse or harassment. And I want to shout out very quickly Coltrane Lord, who is the founder of the Wonderland Project. They're really having an interesting journey trying to raise funds for psychedelic retreats for women who've experienced abuse and trauma. And I think it's so important that we uplift and really support our veteran voices and utilize the need for better veteran mental health care, especially given the sacrifice that they make to serve this country abroad and to do the things that so many of us as civilians aren't willing to do. My hope is that we can extend that conversation, especially because so many of us are only a degree or two separated from the mental health crisis, which affects all of us. And I also want to shout out to your point about, how do we look at other ways to integrate these treatments and, beyond just the clinical care model. Harvard has a really phenomenal Petrie-Flom Center for psychedelic law and health policy law. They have the Pulse program for psychedelics in society and culture. One of their fellows, actually, Reverend Jamie Clark Souls of SMU. She gave a phenomenal presentation at the Harvard Intersections of Psychedelics and Religion conference earlier this year that I was fortunate enough to sit in on part of, and talked a lot about what integrating harm reduction services and psychedelics might look like, in a traditional religious context, in the Christian church. And there's real interest from Christian communities in how psychedelics fit into our spaces. But, so many churches offer, for example, soup kitchens or homeless assistance or, shelters. Why can't there be a legal, safe avenue for better substance abuse care than they're able to currently provide? Especially if there's a religious exemption. I think it's a conversation that I'd really like Texas to be a leader on, especially with such a strong, Christian identity in so much of the Texas conservative kind of context. And yeah, no, I'm just super grateful that you mentioned those next gen modalities that I think we should really be tapping into for the next wave of research. And to your point about mental health conditions being fatal, eating disorders is one that we don't talk about enough, but that really is a fatal condition if not addressed. And it's not the same as having a suicidal ideation. And it seems illogical and irrational from an outsider's perspective, but very much can literally whittle away at someone until there's nothing left. I know Dr. Robin Carhart Harris had a really great commentary on this recently. I'd recommend folks looking up his comments on that. We're coming down to the last 20-minute stretch here, so I really want to take some time to focus on what implementation looks like. First things first, given the Lieutenant Governor's statement last night, it seems like Governor Greg Abbott is poised to sign this bill into law. That can be a tricky process as far as what comes next. What does that timeline potentially look like? And I know you can't make any bold predictions, but do we see that happening sooner or maybe at the end of the legislative session, which I believe is June 11th, correct?
End of the legislative session is June 2nd, actually.
June 2nd, okay.
Yeah. 11 days from now, I think, June 2nd. It all gets confusing. I only know it because it's the day I've been looking forward to since the legislative session started. Bold predictions on when he might sign it. I think there are certainly advocates, folks in our coalition, who are really hoping for a signing on sine die, as we call it, the last day of session. That there's something I think really kind of poetic and beautiful about that being maybe one of the last acts that happen when the legislature is still there, when everyone is still together. The governor's ability to sign the legislation extends past the conclusion of session into June during the signing and veto period, where he'll be reviewing every piece of legislation that he hasn't signed yet that has passed the legislature. And so, my prediction would say I would put June 2nd as the earliest day we could see a signing, and then anytime after that through the month of June. And an interesting fact is it also can become law without a signature. While we do hope and expect the governor will likely sign this, House Bill 1802 became law without his signature, which is oftentimes a reflection of the legislature's strong support for this, the people of Texas's popular support for this, really carrying something into law. There wasn't a statement issued, but certainly a testament to that work that happened there. And then for implementation, and I know we can dive deeper into this, but to make a prediction on the timeline for implementation on something like this is nearly impossible because it's really never been done. Just from like the agency perspective, the legislation is signed. Most legislation in Texas goes into effect on September 1st. Because this got such strong support, it is eligible to be immediately effective, but it's still going to have to wait for the new fiscal year for the funding from this budget into the next biennium to become available. And that's when you're going to see Health and Human Services Commission take those steps to establish the framework for this program, put out the RFPs, go through that application process, find out, who are going to be our partners on the private side, who are going to be our partners on the research side, and then get to work. And I think there will be activity related to that starting immediately upon signing. I mean, at least conversations related to it that then become the plan, in the notebook, get sketched out, and then get turned into actual, regulatory policy. And that we might see updates on who those partners are going to be in Q1, Q2, maybe Q3 at the latest of next year. But I would expect that there is going to be urgency around this, obviously, because, to put it quite simply, people are dying, available treatments are insufficient, and we're not taking the lead on this. As Cody Harris said, Texas dared to stand up and say, we're not waiting for permission, we're making history. And I think we're not going to wait for permission to move forward. I think once we feel we've got it right, we're going to move forward with earnest.
But to that point, the bill lays out what would be a 4-year implementation program of the research process, et cetera, correct? That could also be hampered potentially by stuff with the FDA, stuff with the DEA. So yeah, difficult to predict how that will actually play out. But can you speak to a little bit what that proposed 4-year rollout process might look like?
Yeah, certainly. I can kind of do my best to outline it. So I've talked a lot about the RFP, about kind of the setup. While that's happening, that advisory board is going to be established to kind of oversee this with subject matter experts, philanthropic partners, representation from veterans and legislative appointees, agency appointees. Once that is all in place and things begin, step one is a phase 1 trial, right? Which is going to be really the kind of first major checkpoint for this. For a lot of people, it'll be when the trial starts. I think for those of us who are all eagerly following this, it'll be when the trial ends. And then that opens the door to phase 2. And when we clear phase 2, that's when you get to phase 3. And I think when, especially Brian talks about the timeline, it's really getting to phase 3 as quickly as possible, responsibly making sure the data is accurate and substantive, and certainly the patients are safe while we're doing it. It's all safety and efficacy trials in phase 1 and 2 anyway. But getting there is important, because phase 3, the completion of phase 3, is what proves the case to the FDA that this treatment works. But also in phase 3, that is when the clinical trials will include sick individuals who have the conditions that we are treating, and so that's the opportunity for the healing to really reach the Texans even before approval in that clinical research process. And so that's really what I think a lot of people's eyes are going to be on as we move through this. And the kind of last thing I'll say about the federal government, certainly the FDA and DEA approval processes are burdensome, you might generously call them. Delays related to the FDA DEA approvals actually slowed down House Bill 1802's clinical trial approval, necessitating an extension on that trial, because we had put an expiration in that bill. There is no expiration in this bill, because we are preparing, hoping for the best, preparing for the worst. And when I talk about hoping for the best, I think regardless of if it gets moved to Schedule 3, certainly I, don't have insight into what's happening there. But even if the federal government won't do that, there are other things they could do from an agency perspective or from a legislative perspective. If Congress wants to act, we have a unified Congress right now. Republicans control both chambers and the White House. Reforms to the FDA application, DEA application, and approval processes to make them a little bit more efficient, to take a look at it and say, hey, this kind of feels like we're going to the DMV and we're getting our number and we're doing paperwork and we're having to, submit the same form in different colors and in triplicate. What can we do to make this more efficient? I know, and I think there's a big conversation about government efficiency happening right now with consequences, positive, negative, but certainly consequences. And maybe one of the consequences of that conversation is these processes are too slow, they're too burdensome. There are ways we can make them more efficient while maintaining high standards of science, high standards of research, safety, efficacy, and quality of care.
Yeah, which is certainly a big concern with some of the funding cuts, that the quality of the science that's able to be conducted won't be as high. So it's really encouraging to know that you guys are thinking that way and thinking about those things as this next phase rolls out. I want to get to some questions in a second, because we've had a couple that really stick out. But there's, you've mentioned a lot of folks within the legislature and surrounding your coalition that have been phenomenal, but Texans for Greater Mental Health has a really outstanding team. Who from your crew, from the T4 GMH crew, should we be hearing from and looking to for additional leadership in this space, and both as thought leaders and as action leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. We are very, very fortunate to have what I think is kind of the all-star team in Texas. So, two of our advisors, really two of our critical advisors, Dr. Lynette Averill, Baylor College of Medicine and Menninger Clinic, is a leading voice, not just in research, but also in bringing bringing the science to the policy, to the legislature. She's testified not just in Texas, but in Georgia, in Hawaii, in the United States Congress, even in the Canadian Senate. So I think continue to look to Dr. Averill as certainly a leading voice in this. Dr. Greg Fonzo, co-director of the McGill Center for Psychedelic Research and Therapy at UT Del Med, he is leading what I think is one of the most exciting psychedelic research centers in the United States. They're taking a slightly different approach. You mentioned Justin Lepre, if I'm not mistaken. They're even working with Illuminating Collective on doing some research related to the ceremonial aspect. So they're really taking this comprehensive kind of multimodal approach to the way they're doing the science. And I think you can look to Greg as well as continuing to be a leader, and I think maybe a growing leader in the conversation about where science meets policy. And then I really want to highlight one more person from our team, although really you could look to the entire team. But that would be Chase Rowan, who is a former Army Ranger, who is our veteran engagement coordinator, who was kind of one of the lead witnesses and advocates for the Texas Ibogaine Initiative. This was really his first outing as a vocal advocate and supporter of this, even though it has had, transformational impact on his life. Getting to the point where you're ready to tell your story publicly takes time, but now he's telling it, and he's telling it, everywhere that he possibly can. And I think as we look at the veterans who are leaders in this space on conversation, Marcus Capone and his wife, Amber, Vets was founded in Southlake, Texas. I think you will see Chase Rowan emerge also as one of kind of the key voices on this, especially in Texas.
Well, Chase, if you're watching or if you hear from Logan later, I'd love to do a PSA profile with you, a Q&A. Same with the Capones. We've not met yet, but I'm a big fan of all the work that y'all are doing and would love to speak. But there's also, we'll get to questions in a second, but there's also a Southern Coalition that's formed, right? I know we talked about, you guys have, have some friends over in North Carolina that are doing some really exciting things and might have a lobbying day coming up. Stay tuned. There's a PSA column coming on that in the near future. But who else is involved in the Southern Coalition, and what do you think that the rest of? I know there's a new Northeastern Coalition that has the folks in Massachusetts have helped spearhead. What can individual states learn from what you guys have been building, kind of an interstate coalition that's regionally focused?
Yeah, absolutely. This coalition formed, really, because a couple of us who were doing the work in different Southern states, Gina Giorgio, who you mentioned, in the Carolinas, Gary Hess, based out of Louisiana, kind of had independently met or been connected, or we were one degree of separation away. And we said, hey, let's get together because, you can go farther together. So Gina Giorgio, certainly in North Carolina, the North Carolina Psychedelic Policy Coalition, I think she is going to continue to emerge as a key leader, not just in the South, but nationally. Gary Hess, who just recently joined the Veteran Mental Health Leadership Coalition, a Louisianan. Adam Marr, originally a Texan, is now out there in Alabama. Really coming together to take what Texas has done, what Georgia has done, what we hope North Carolina is going to do, and then also take it to those other Southern states while pushing those states, a little bit further. And the things that I think that we can learn is, one, I think there's a lot of people who, if you turn back the clock, would have said, don't even waste your time. Don't go to Atlanta, don't go to Raleigh, don't go to Austin, because the Southern states are never going to do this. Well, we've turned that on its head. And I think established a model for what's possible in conservative states, and not just conservative Southern states, right? You got purple states like Georgia and North Carolina that I think can take up a mantle of saying, we're willing to go in this direction, supporting research, having conversations about access, having conversations about how do we make sure these are available to our citizens when they become available, while other states and other parts of the country that maybe have different political dynamics can push things in a different direction. You look at New Mexico, kind of a different model. Who's to say what's right or wrong? Certainly, I know what I think is right for Texas. But if all of the states are doing what is right for them, what is uniquely fits those states, that gives a laboratory effect to the federal government to be able to say, this is what's working here, this is what's not working here, this is what's working there. Now here's the national model where we get to learn from everything that has happened. And that's really at the core of what the American political federalist system is supposed to be. The states are nimble and able to move a little faster and be a little bit more experimental than the federal government, and then kind of lead the federal government. I think certainly in the latter half of the 20th century, we saw that change, and now we're seeing it come back around.
So agreed. I think, I talk a lot about the need for ground up change in psychedelic and drug policy reform efforts rather than top down. I think there's a lot of folks in the national scene that are involved in some of the state-by-state policy reforms that really look to a top-down model. Again, I think really what stands up out of Texas, this is as Texas grown as any initiative has ever been. I think I continue to be very encouraged about that. I want to get to questions because Crystal Salas, I'm going to put it up here on the screen, had two really great ones. The first being, what could a clinical site who's already doing psychedelic trials do to potentially get involved? Is that a reach out to your legislator situation?
I mean, certainly you can reach out to your legislator, but the process for involvement is going to be through Health and Human Service Commission's RFP. If you're a site that's already doing clinical trials, you're probably somewhat experienced in responding to these type of things. Even the federal government's RFP that went out related to the funding secured through the Douglas Mike Day Act is maybe a template for how that application process may work. So, certainly reach out to your legislator. They can help guide you through that process. They can help champion you. The decision will be made, if I'm not mistaken, like by the agency with advice from that oversight board. And I am optimistic that those sites that are already doing the research, have the experience that we can bring it to bear on day one and hit the ground running, but also that sites that haven't started this research yet that are very interested. I know Texas Tech University, for example, is deeply interested in being involved in the Ibogaine Initiative, are able to kind of join the fray and add another psychedelic research center, research program in Texas. Because if I'm not mistaken, California has more than us right now, and we're going to need to correct that. We're going to need the most in the United States, as far as I'm concerned.
I respect that. I would love for the good folks down in Lubbock to pick up the slack and add something too. I have a story for you at a later time about how Texas Tech beat the heck out of Virginia when I was a kid. And it's never sat right with me, but I'll let it slide if they can pick it up on the psychedelic research. Crystal had another great question, and I guess we'll close with this. We talked a lot about integration and how you guys are viewing this process moving forward. Fireside Project is obviously doing a really great job on free, accessible peer support through their hotline program, some of the other harm reduction resources. Where does peer support fit into the framework that comes next?
Yeah, I mean, peer support is foundational, I think, to this entire conversation. I'll look at vets as kind of a model for the way they've done it with their healing grants and their grantees. Peer support is such a key part of what's happening. It's not just the prep, it's not just the treatment, not even just necessarily the integration therapy with a licensed mental health care provider. It's having someone who's been through it before, who can kind of be there for you, a steady hand, a voice of reason or concern whenever they notice something happening, someone who you can go to and say, hey, I'm having this experience. Did you have this? Can you help me understand and process what's going on? Because you don't, from my perspective, and I think this is shared across the coalition, and I would, hopefully argue across Texas, no one wants anyone going through this alone. So many people struggle with certainly mental health conditions, even physical health conditions alone. It's one of the consequences of the, rugged individualist identity of the United States and Texas. But a consequence of that is that, that loneliness when things get tough. Just having someone that you can reach out to, talk to for support can be such a game changer. And that's why peer support is critical at vets. It's why it's critical for most of these treatment programs you're seeing internationally, and why I think it's critical to advocates that as we work through implementation, that is a key part of the conversation.
So agreed. Excited to see what comes next. We'll end here for now. But Logan, I want to thank you again so much for taking the time. I know you've got to get down to the State House and hit the ground, foot to pavement. So we'll let you get to that. But any closing thoughts or wisdom to leave us with, any advice for states who might be trying to move in the direction that Texas is moving? And also, how can we hear more from you? And where can folks find your information?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a couple of things. There's a saying, other states use it. I think it's certainly fitting in this case for Texas. As goes Texas, so goes the nation. So for other states that are interested in doing something, whether it's Ibogaine, whether it's psilocybin, researching an existing compound, pushing the boundaries to a new one, establishing a task force to start to evaluate the opportunities, point to Texas, use us as an example to challenge your legislature, to challenge your elected leaders to go forward. We have provided political cover, I think, for the entire country here. So now it's just, what are you willing to do? And if you challenge them, I think they will go much farther than they would go if you didn't do that. And then the final thing I'll say, where you can find me, Texans for Greater Mental Health, social media is kind of everywhere, at T4GMH. You can find us on Instagram, you can find us on Twitter, you can find us on Facebook and LinkedIn, Texans for Greater Mental Health. And you'll hear more about what's happening in Texas. And also, once our legislative session ends, we'll be turning around and looking at the other 49 states and Washington and keeping tabs and keeping people updated on what's happening there. Also, I think final thing, you can find me, but as you're thinking about doing something in your state, what happened in Texas was, through Texans for Greater Mental Health, Texans created an organization, an entity that served as an anchor for these national groups to be able to come in and do the work. I would encourage you, whether it's forming a formal organization or just getting some folks together, even in a group text or a weekly or monthly meeting, try to get together that coalition, that local coalition that can anchor things in your state, and then reach out to those national partners, reach out to vets, reach out to the Reed Foundation, the American Ibogaine Initiative, Brian Hubbard, reach out to the Veteran Mental Health Leadership Coalition to come in and give you the support that you need to get something across the finish line.
Yeah, no, well said. I've heard it. I'm going to butcher the quote exactly, but never forget that a small committed group of citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. With that, Logan, thank you again so much. We'll let you get back down to the State House. To be continued, everyone. Again, my name is Jack Gorsline. This was the Psychedelic States of America's Advocacy Spotlight Initiative presentation of what's next for psychedelics in Texas. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Jack.
Yep.